So, during World War One, crisis arises in the Russian Empire, of course, because the Russian Revolution happens first. The first one, February 1917. We can call that the March Revolution as well, depending on the calendar you're using, and the later October Revolution in 1917 brings Lenin and the communists into power, and a new government, a Soviet Union, comes onto the scene. So we have an emergence of new powers before the war ends, and when that happens, there's deals being made in many ways with some of the people in the region. So Lenin supports the emergence of the Baltic states becoming independent nations. It's a time saver, really, because he doesn't have time to fight the war in that area. So as the Russian Revolution ends, the Russian Civil War begins. So the forces to push out the communists begin their attacks very early on. In early 1918, before World War I ends, Lenin and Trotsky make a deal with the Germans to end the war on the Eastern Front. And this is accomplished by a treaty called the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, and which basically gives a large amount of the Russian Empire to the Germans at the time period. So they generally just handed over a lot of territory, and including much of the Baltics and of Ukraine and such. When all this chaos is going on, we see a lot of these nations calling for their independence. Ukraine, for the first time in the Western Ukraine, there are those locals who call for an independent Ukraine. They get some support from the Germans in this case, as an opposition to the Russians. It's very short-lived, and when the war ends completely in the East, because it ends in the West in November of 1918, but the Russian Civil War wages on in Russia, but also they have minor sideline wars in areas like the Ukraine and in Poland especially. And Poland will fight against the Russian forces from 1918 to the early 1920s, 2021. It's basically over. And Poland, who are we talking about? Poland's back on the map again in 1918, when they declare themselves independent following the end of the German pullout from this region. In the quick treaty that is made in 1918, the end of fighting, Germany must pull out of its troops in much of this region, but in some cases, Germany is also given in charge to try to keep control of these areas as well, because the Allies have no ability to take control of these new lands. So it's a time period of complete chaos is really the only way to describe it. And there's changing of power over and over again, and the communists are in power, or the right-wing nationalists are in power, or the Germans are back occupying, or the Russians are back. And this history at this time period is extremely violent. So the guns fall silent in the West, but in the East, it's a mess. And in the end, though, we had the emergence of new states in Central and Eastern Europe, small states and large states. Poland is one of the new large states. It gets support from France to become a state. The French see the Poles as a large piece of territory that can act as a buffer to the aggression between Germany and Russia. Smaller states are created. The Treaty of Versailles, in some cases, sanctions these already formed states. So the Treaty of Versailles is often blamed for divvying up Europe, but in many ways they solidify what was going on in the ground in areas they couldn't control. What was happening in Poland, the Allies wanted to control and were unable. What was happening in the Baltics, they wanted to control and were unable. And so it forms this new history for the first time. Poland reemerges for the first time in 100 years. The Baltic states are independent nations for the first time in their own history. And there's a whole slew of other states that are there as well. Czechoslovakia and Hungary is without Austria and in much reduced fashion. We'll talk about later. Romania appears as much larger, and Yugoslavia eventually emerges. This will be a kingdom of Croats and Serbs and Slovenes at first. And the 20th century sees this is a tentative time for these states. They're nervous about what will happen, and they weather the 20th century in the early parts of the 20th century in a state of anxiety. And Poland has a small corridor to the Baltic Sea, the Danzig corridor, which cuts into traditionally Prussian German-controlled areas. And the city of Danzig, which was a historically German city since the time of the Teutonic Knights, becomes a Polish city, becomes Gdansk. And this becomes a great bone of contention for the Germans. And the Germans look to the east as this area where they've populated much of Central and Eastern Europe for many centuries, controlling towns and commerce in many areas along with Jews. And the Germans increasingly see this area as something that they want to colonize once again, once the rise of Hitler occurs in the late 30s. Why does Hitler appear on the scene? Much of it comes down to the Great Depression, and most historians agree that the economic crisis of Central and Eastern Europe was much harsher than what had happened in the West and in America, although it was terrible during that time period. These nations face worse circumstances, and the recovery of Germany right before the war forebodes its future colonization of this area. The Kate Brown book you're reading is going to go into a high level of detail of what happens during the war, and I'll let that happen. This region has many stories like what she tells in that area, a biography of no place. She deals with Poles living in the western Ukrainian type area, and all the lunacy that goes around with identifying who is who in this area. After World War II is over, all of the culture and history of this area has been shattered, and really that's the only way to describe it. The Polish German presence is, or the German presence of Eastern Europe changes, is removed at the end of the war. 13 million Germans are expelled back to Germany. Ethnic cleansing happens all over the place. Especially under Stalin, he forcibly removes Poles from that crazy region into this new formed Poland that heads west, and Eastern Europe becomes part of the sphere of influence of the Soviet Union up until the 89 through 91 revolutions, which I said we'll talk about in the conclusion chapters. Suffice to say, the history of World War II in the region was more violent, more brutal, more devastating than anything that happened in the West. The story of the war is in the East, and I highly suggest if that's something you're interested in to pursue it further. Anthony Rusino writes a great book about the invasion of Poland. Omer Bartov about the invasion into Russia. But this violent, horrible war leads to the death of the Jewish people of Eastern Europe, the expulsion of the Germans in the end, and finally new